The Browns don't have to take a quarterback just because they're picking number 2 overall. I'll talk about it coming up on the Locked On Browns podcast.
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Dog Pound? I'm Spencer German, your host of the Locked On Browns podcast, and proudly covering your Cleveland Browns each and every single day in the land and on the road. The Browns can't take a quarterback at number 2 out of desperation. Speaking of quarterbacks, I think the Sam Darnold ship has officially sailed, and it may not be easy to find many cap casualties on this loaded Browns roster right now, given all the deferred money that they've put into contracts. But I did identify 3 players that the Browns could consider cutting this off-season. I do want to thank you for being an everydayer with the Locked On Browns podcast and making us your first listen every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. We get after it as always. And listen, I understand it is maybe the most hotly debated topic right now in Browns fan circles and across Cleveland sports, the Cleveland sports scene right now. What should the Browns do at number 2 overall? And many people want them, maybe you want them, to take a quarterback at number 2. And there's a valid argument for that. It's the one position they haven't been able to identify for years. The one time it seemed like they maybe did identify it, they traded that guy away, ended up getting Deshaun Watson. And here we are still looking for that franchise quarterback for this team. So I understand the intrigue and I understand the desire to finally get that position right and bring in somebody who can fill that role and fill that void for the Browns and answer questions that haven't been answered, frankly, for decades at this point. But it has become a full-fledged Browns fan on Browns fan crime over the last week with people debating what they should do with the number 2 overall pick. And I think it's important to remember that you can't just do something out of desperation if you're Andrew Berry in this Browns front office. My official stance on the QB situation as it pertains to being the number 2 pick in the NFL draft is that if you can get Shedeur Sanders, great. I said in an episode late last week that I think Shedeur Sanders is actually a perfect fit for the Browns and for and for the offense that Kevin Stefanski runs. But if he's gone, then I don't know that Cam Ward is that right fit, and I don't know that the Browns just take him to take him. So if that's the case, I think then you trade back. And as much as the Browns need a QB, you don't, again, just take one to take one. That is what desperate teams do. And desperate teams are operating from a place of really not clear thinking and from a place of a disadvantage. That's probably the biggest reason why the Browns have gotten into the situation that they've been to at this point when they've drafted quarterbacks like Johnny Manziel, who they've completely botched, or Brandon Weeden, who wasn't really going to ever amount to much of anything because they felt desperate and they needed to take a quarterback and they thought that they could sell those guys and make it happen. I understand the urge and the need to go out and get that position. It's the position everybody covets. But if this class is, as scouts are saying, not that great, and people are worried about how these guys are going to project in the NFL, and if Shedeur is the only one that the Browns even have graded highly enough that's worth taking at that pick, and he's not on the board, then what are you supposed to do? Just take one because you feel like you can't just take one because you feel like it's a need that you got to fill on a roster. It has to be a fit. It has to be a player that you think matches essentially what you want to do, what you're trying to do on offense and matches what your team is. Hypothetically, if the Browns end up liking Shedeur, but they're iffy on Cam Ward, then basically they'd already be settling for a quarterback that they aren't even sure is the guy to what end. What are the means of that? Just because they would need to appease a vocal portion of the fan base that are sick of not having a good QB. I get it. You want a quarterback, and I understand the burning desires inside Browns fans to finally feel like they have a quarterback that they can cheer for. You look around the league and you see other teams landing these quarterbacks, and it's frustrating, especially in your own division where you have Lamar Jackson and Joe Burrow putting up massive MVP like seasons year after year. And so it's got to be frustrating. I understand that. But again, you can't just take one to take one. You have to believe that play, like the valuations on these guys matter. That's what these teams are all doing. And maybe you don't trust them to give the right or fair valuations of these guys. And that's a valid concern. And that I think goes back to questioning whether or not they should be running it back with this entire regime still intact. And, if you trust Andrew Berry or not to be the person using that pick for whatever, that number 2 pick for whatever purpose they're going to use it for. And if they trade back, maybe using multiple first round picks for whatever purpose they're going to use them for. And I understand all those concerns. I do. But that's a different conversation. If you're questioning Andrew Berry, it doesn't help your cause, or it doesn't help his cause to earn back your trust if he just blindly takes a quarterback because he's like, well, we need one, we might as well try this one out. Like, no, that's not how these things work in the NFL. It's a long, drawn out process of scouting guys throughout the year, scouting guys throughout the college football season, figuring out what their strengths and weaknesses are, and then projecting how they're going to fit into your offense, into your team, into the dynamics of your locker room. Like, all those things come into play. And yeah, some people get them wrong. Like, it's always an inexact science. But if you miss on the like everyone who's saying like that's the only option, you just got to do it. And you got to be able to sell it. And you got to be able to like pivot from Deshaun. And I get all the reasons why people are saying these things. But if they miss on it too, like, they're all out of a job anyway. So if the plan ends up being like, let's go get a veteran, let's go try to bridge the gap and bolster the rosters in as many other places as we can, and try our luck with a potentially being able to draft a quarterback next year, I can at least wrap my mind around that idea. And I think this all stems from people maybe feeling that it's impossible to get back up into this territory to draft a quarterback again. If you're there this year, like, that's, what if it doesn't happen next year? What if you're not in that position? If the Browns don't get a quarterback that's really viable, they could be in this exact same position a year from now anyway. But regardless, on top of that, that's why I think trading back, if you do it and you get the right capital in return, like, you could theoretically get a pick next year that allows you to have more to trade to move up in the draft and draft that franchise guy that you maybe are coveting. Again, it all comes back to me, to how this class is being viewed. And I understand where you're so persistent. You might be so persistent in this team's efforts and in the misses that they've had at that position that you just want to see him draft one. You want to put the Deshaun Watson thing behind you, and that's easier to do when you can sell and market a rookie to the fan base. But at the same time, I trust the NFL scout evaluations that are saying that this class probably has some shortcomings. And and some people have compared it to the 2022 class, by the way, which was what, like Kenny Pickett and Malik Willis. Like, if that's what you're getting, like, I'm not saying Shedeur Sanders is Kenny Pickett. I already said Shedeur Sanders is the guy I would take. So if he's there too, sure, pull the trigger. I got no problem with that. But if he's not there and you don't feel so highly of Cam Ward, like, what good does it do you if you end up with, I'm not going to say he's Kenny Pickett, but like with the next Kenny Pickett, who's a first round pick that doesn't really turn into anything. And then you're still spinning your tires and you're still asking yourself these questions. Like, my biggest thing in this entire conversation comes down to how the team feels about the quarterbacks. If they evaluate Cam Ward and maybe they like Cam Ward more than Shedeur Sanders. And if that's the case, fine, take him. Go ahead. I got no problem with that if that's how they feel. But again, given what we've heard about this class, and things can change. It's only January 14th. Things can certainly change between now, the draft, really between now and the combine, and then the combine and the draft. So there's a lot of different things, a lot of different moving parts. We know how these draft processes go when it comes to these players and rising and falling stock. And there's probably guys that we're not even really talking about right now that could end up being first round picks by the time this process is over. Jackson Dart, a guy coming out of Ole Miss, could be someone who rises up boards or whatever. So yeah, there's maybe Quinn Ewers if he actually comes out, although there's a lot of rumors saying he might go back to college. So who knows? But regardless, my biggest point in all this is, like, you don't just take one to take one because you're desperate. That would be a very ill-advised thing to do. It would signal a bad front office and a bad evaluation process as you go through and try to identify players that fit your team and that you're trying to build around. So, like, I think it would be stupid and silly of the organization just to do that, because they feel pressured to finally get that right. They got to know and feel good about it. Once they do if they feel good about it and they do their evaluations and they like both these guys and they're okay with either one, great. I can live with that. But if they come away with it and they feel like they're settling for a guy that was like further down their board and not a guy that they think is going to be a good fit, you just can't do it. You just can't do it. I'm sorry. Speaking of quarterbacks, and speaking of maybe the opposite, the alternative to drafting a rookie, which would be finding a veteran to bridge the gap, I think they can check one, the Browns that is, off their list of quarterbacks to potentially pursue this offseason, veteran options. That is, I will tell you who and why coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. This is a message from our sponsor, Intuit TurboTax. Are you tired of the endless waiting, wondering, and worrying about your taxes? Well, now that's a thing of the past. Yes, you see, taxes don't need to be complicated or stressful. TurboTax is here to change the game by matching you with a TurboTax expert who can help you work on your return right away. No more waiting for answers. No more wondering if you're missing out on deductions, whether you got one form or you need 20 forms. TurboTax experts give your taxes their undivided attention while you get real-time updates on the progress so you can focus on what really matters to you. You won't have to lift a finger, but you'll get the peace of mind knowing that your taxes are being handled by the pros. Ready for a stress-free taxes and the most money back guaranteed? Head on over to TurboTax.com today and get matched with your expert who's ready to take your taxes off your plate. Only available with TurboTax Live full service. Real-time updates only in the iOS mobile app. See guaranteed details at turbotax.com/guarantees. Yeah, so as of recording this, the Rams-Vikings game just went final. And I can say wholeheartedly after watching that game play out, after watching the Lions and Vikings play out in week 18 a week ago, that decided between the Vikings and the Lions who was going to be the number one overall seed. I think the Browns can pass on trying to pursue or add Sam Darnold and make him their bridge quarterback option in 2025. I get it. He had this renaissance season. He put up some incredible numbers. I mean, there was a couple games this year where he threw for over 300 plus yards and was really impressive. And it looked like he was on this kind of like bounce back path in his career. And it was exciting stuff. It was fun stuff. You know, Vikings fans had a very memorable season, even though it's going to end here in the wild card round for them, which I'm sure is frustrating given how successful they were. And I did talk about that and on other platforms. Like, imagine going into the last week of the season. You are 13 and 3, and you know that, or I guess you're 14 and 2, and you know the two teams that were playing with 14 and 2, and you knew that the loser of that game with the second best record in the NFC was going to end up being a road team in the wild card round. That is mind-boggling, and maybe an example of why they need to change the playoff format. But that's a conversation for another day. Regardless, Vikings falling short, I feel like largely hinged on the play of Sam Darnold. Even after the memorable season he had, the two biggest games of his season, the two biggest games of his career, felt like he was not the quarterback that they needed him to be. It felt like there were some the shortcomings, the holding the ball too long, the not really being able to process the field. Felt like those things kind of reared their ugly head with him again. And that's problematic for a guy that was hoping for a big payday this offseason. Like, I can't even fathom the money and earnings that Darnold cost himself this offseason. Now, maybe that ends up being a good thing for the Vikings in the sense that they can re-sign him and just bring him back on a cheaper deal and let him start next year while J.J. McCarthy continues to come back from his injury. And so he doesn't get just like thrust into the fire immediately at the start of next season. But at the same time, like, if that was an option for the Browns, if Sam Darnold was somebody that they were considering, I think he's off my list now of options. Like, I understood why there was some hype there. Again, coming from similar sort of systems and schemes with Kevin O'Connell and obviously, you know, Kevin Stefanski and the things that they want to do and these new sort of innovative offenses. And if Kevin O'Connell can do it, why can't Kevin Stefanski do it in terms of like a reclamation project? But I think that these last two games kind of showed that I think it was Bomani Jones of ESPN who tweeted something like, instead of Sam Darnold, he is Same Darnold. Like, it's the same guy that we were used to. Now he did get sacked 9 times. It was a brutal game against the Rams tonight, or on Monday night. But like I said, just felt like you were seeing the shades of the who Sam Darnold was and who we thought Sam Darnold was these last couple games. And what's, I think, the most alarming is that was the 2 most important games for Darnold's season. Against the Lions in week 18, he went 18 of 41, 43% completion percentage, 166 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions. Against the Rams, he was 25 of 40, 245 yards. Not terrible numbers. He had the 1 touchdown and 1 interception. But it was, again, the way he was processing things. And it was the fact that the offense seemed to really just be in a rut these last couple weeks. Like, they'd marched down the field, and then they couldn't punch it across the finish line. They couldn't get into the end zone to score. And that was, I think, the most alarming thing. It was, you know, if the offense was sort of struggling with him out there, and it became like this late in the season, you expected that group to kind of just be humming on all cylinders for the Vikings, and that he'd be sort of like locked in given how well he had played to that point. But it wasn't there for him. And I think that's concerning from a standpoint of trying to, if you're considering bringing him in, I think the same tendencies, the same problems do still exist. And I do think Kevin O'Connell deserves a lot of credit for masking those, but I just don't know if the Browns should take the chance or the swing on trying to essentially bank on a maybe lightning in a bottle type season for Darnold and use that as the reason why they're bringing him in to try to replicate that here in Cleveland and hope that it leads to, a similarly successful season, maybe not 14-3, but a similarly successful season that ends with, you in the playoffs and trying to win, because I think we've now seen someone like Sam Darnold's only going to get you so far. Now, I get it. The options aren't great. We just talked about that in the first segment. Like, you're banking on, no matter what, you're banking on a Kirk Cousins to sort of resurrect his career. You're banking on some of these other potential veterans to sort of resurrect their career and hoping that something just kind of comes to fruition and they can reclaim something. So I get it, but I almost am inclined to be like, if you're going to do a reclamation project, don't be like what I wanted to say. I don't really want to say. We try to keep this as PG as possible. It's a family show. Don't be like the third wheel, if you will. Like, don't be the team that's like, we'll take him now that he was revived somewhere else, and we think that maybe we can sort of replicate that. Like, maybe try your own reclamation project. Somebody like Daniel Jones comes to mind. And again, I'm not saying these options are great. I understand why people are upset with the options that the Browns have. This is kind of just the hand that they've been dealt because of what they did with the Deshaun Watson deal. And this all kind of does stem into the original conversation of like, do you draft a quarterback? Do you not draft a quarterback at number 2? And I think that's also part of the reason why people are so adamant. Some fans are so adamant about why you do take a quarterback at number 2, because they don't like the options that are out there. But the idea that like there's not options that exist is not true. It's just there's not a lot of good ones that make you feel the warm and fuzzies about the quarterback position and the Browns in 2025, which is totally understandable when we're talking about the names that we're talking about. But I just think I saw enough from Sam Darnold these last couple of weeks. Like even Kirk Cousins is more intriguing to me because of his connection and his history with Stefanski. And I thought he honestly, like, he played pretty well early in the season. Then he just had this massive drop off for like 5 games where he was a disaster. And so that's the biggest thing for me is like, what happened there? Can Kevin Stefanski kind of reclaim that? And maybe he can't, but I because the connection's there, I'm more willing to sort of take a chance like that, or find a different reclamation project than Sam Darnold, who's already been recycled once. And then when things got tight and you needed him to show up, he dropped the ball and was the same guy that he used to be with the Jets in his previous stops. So yeah, I think I'm good on Sam Darnold, even though I know there's not a lot of other good options out there. And we're all kind of just like, splitting hairs on which veteran journeyman backup quarterback or just quarterback in general that you want for the Browns in 2025 if they decide, obviously, not to take one in with that number 2 overall pick. And in regards to building this roster for 2025, I tried to identify 3 players that could sort of be cap casualties, if you will, for the Cleveland Browns. It's hard to do because there's so much voided year money in a lot of these contracts that it's not an easy feat to find guys that you can just remove from the roster, release, and save money. But I think I identified 3 for you. I will give them to you next, coming up on the Locked On Browns podcast. A couple of months back in November, actually, I had the chance to go to my first ever Ohio State-Michigan game with my wife. We had an absolute blast. Well, at least until the game itself was over and the Buckeyes lost their 4th in a row to the Wolverines. But we did get to see the potential national champion Ohio State Buckeyes. We'll see how Monday plays out. Disappointing as the game was that we went to, I do not regret my ticket buying experience through Gametime. I'll tell you, my ticket buying experience went so smoothly with Gametime that it has now become my number one ticket buying place when I'm trying to do anything from sports, concerts, etc. I go to Gametime first. Plus, they have a new feature called Gametime Picks, which makes it much easier to get tickets to your favorite events by allowing you to filter out the fluff. Essentially, it shows you only the incredible deals on great seats, so you don't have to waste time searching through thousands of tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. What time is it? Game time? All right, like I said, I tried to identify 3 players that the Browns might be willing to or looking to release this offseason that will potentially give them some much needed salary cap relief in 2025 and potentially into 2026. This is not an easy feat because Andrew Berry loves, and I mean loves, to add voided years on these contracts and spread the money out over a longer period of time and sort of have those like funny years in there, those dummy years in there to help that cause. All in the name, obviously, of basically like just kicking the can down the road as the salary cap continues to go up and understanding like, well, we'll pay that later when there's more money to account for on the cap and the percentage of how much that's going to eat up is lower, if that all makes sense. I'm not trying to, I was told there'd be no math, right? I don't want to give you math. I'm not good at math. I hate that stuff. So I don't want to confuse you, but that's basically the object of the concept of why Andrew Berry does those things, as we know. But I think I identified at least a couple guys that it would make sense to potentially move on from that would allow the Browns to at least free up some cap space. And none of these, by the way, would allow them to free up cap space like before free agency. This would all come with that post June 1st designation, which would basically give you that money leading up to the season, but not so much like immediately. That can still be important though, in the sense that the money you free up in the summer could be used to help you establish some leftover cap space that you roll over, obviously, into 2026, because the NFL has that rollover cap rule. So the first one on this list, and I think this is kind of an obvious one, is safety Juan Thornhill. This feels like an inevitability that the Browns are going to try to move on from Juan Thornhill, just between his effort being questioned at times and his inconsistent play at the safety spot, plus some injuries. I mean, his 2 years so far of a 3-year deal have been woefully disappointing for Cleveland, and it just feels like a divorce, if you will, is inevitable. Unfortunately, he comes with a $12.4 million dead cap hit, again, largely because there's these dummy void years at the end of his deal. So what has to happen here, as I alluded to, is the Browns have to make him a post-June 1st release, and that would break up the payments to about $3.1 million in 2025, $9.2 million in 2026. And they would get $2.5 million in cap relief, which would kick in after June 1st, obviously, when they would designate him. So this one's tough because it's not so much cap relief, and the amount you got to pay over the course of the next 2 years is kind of ridiculous that it might actually just make sense to not move on from him. But I just think like this has run its course. I don't know that he is still somebody that they hold in high esteem and that they want to be. They necessarily want on this team anymore, given again some of the things that we've talked about. I'm assuming the Browns are going to sort of pursue a split here, but the money of it does make it a little bit interesting and a little bit harder potentially to just move on, just to get $2.5 million in cap relief this year, and you won't even get it till the summer anyway. But I'm just kind of banking on the fact that I do think the Browns want to probably explore finding a different route at the safety spot and parting ways with Juan Thornhill. Number 2 on this list is defensive tackle Shelby Harris. Basically, Harris again would have to be a June 1st designation. If he's released before that, he only saves you $954,000 in salary cap relief. So I think that if you designate in post June 1, it saves you $2.6 million in cap space. And you would only have to pay out $556,000 in dead money this year. And then there's a little bit next year, but it's not it's minimal. It's like I think just a little over $1 million or something like that. So it's manageable. And so I do think Harris actually makes some sense. He's kind of an aging guy in his mid-30s, and if you have some ideas as to, first of all, you have Mike Hall, who obviously is a player who you just drafted this past year, and you're hoping can sort of be a foundational piece for you moving forward. Now, in terms of whether or not they have other options or other things they might explore during the draft, that remains to be seen. But I do think like they could look to bolster the defensive line in other ways this upcoming draft, maybe being the primary one, without having to feel like they got to keep Shelby Harris around or re-sign him or whatever. So Shelby Harris feels like it could happen. I know there's a lot of value placed on defensive line under Jim Schwartz. I think that's still going to be the case, but I think they can find other ways to sort of revamp that group that don't involve Shelby Harris, and it gives you some, a decent chunk of cap relief for this year that you could certainly utilize in other ways, or like I said, to help you with the rollover cap that you want to bring back in 2026. And then the third one on this list is Ethan Posick. Now, this one feels like maybe the most far-fetched, largely because I don't know if the Browns are just willingly going to create another hole for themselves on the offensive line. Left tackle's an issue. They got to address that. Jedrick Wills not coming back by my estimation. It would be stunning if they gave him a new contract extension and brought him back next year. And you could have Joel Bitonio retiring, which would create another hole. And so if that happens, if Joel does retire, now you're creating a third spot that you got to address. Now, if Joel stays, maybe it becomes more of a realistic thing. But Posick, again, has to be a June 1st designation if you're going to move on from him, because if you don't, his dead cap is $6.1 million, even with a post-June release, but with the post-June 1st release, it would make the Browns only be on the hook for 1.7 in dead money this year, and they create $5 million in cap space to, again, use for whatever they want to later this summer. Then the dead cap figure next year is 4.3, which again, with the cap going up, as Andrew Berry always likes to do with these deals, not quite as bad as obviously the Juan Thornhill one, which is $9 million. So it's manageable. It's not what you want, but it's manageable. So again, Posick seems like a difficult one to sort of envision, just because, especially if they're trying to get back to what they do best, and we know Posick seemed to fit that mold and fit this offensive line when it was doing more of like the Kevin Stefanski style of the outside zone stuff and the play action stuff. If they get back to the offense, their offensive identity, I think he still works here. But if they are looking for some cap relief and this team could use it, it's an option for them. Again, all three of those, though, come with that June 1st designation because, which again, the key to that is it allows you to spread the dead cap money over the upcoming season and the following season if you do it that way. Simply because, it's cap space that you get later, and you can maybe roll over or whatever. But yeah, like there's some options, but it's not as easy to find them on this roster. Like there's some years where there's obvious ones. Like Nick Chubb was an obvious one last year. If they had really thought about doing that, I know they brought him back and they wanted to bring him back, but they could have cut Nick Chubb and saved like a bunch of money just straight up with going to the final year of his deal. But with how many of these deals have voided years in them now and stuff, it's not so easy just to like find immediate money to give yourself or reward yourself. It takes a little bit more to get that back. And you still end up paying sort of a massive or a bigger dead cap hit later because of how Barry's kind of restructured a lot of these things. So, well, that's going to do it for another episode of the Locked On Browns podcast, Dog Pound. Thank you for joining me as always to talk about your favorite football team as we get deeper and deeper in to off-season football mode. There will be plenty more to talk about in the weeks and months ahead, and I hope you'll continue to make the Locked On Browns podcast your first listen every day. For your second listen, go check out a new Locked On NFL show, or if you want to keep it local, you can check out Locked On Cavs, Locked On Guardians. Thanks for being an everydayer at the Locked On Podcast Network. I will talk to you again real soon, but for now, I'm out.